So, hey gang, let's talk about testing.
Let's do it.
So, oops, let me get my tablet plugged in. All right, so by the end of this lesson, I hope that you will be able to drive your code with tests. That's our goal. So let's start by talking about TDD a little bit. So contrary to popular belief, TDD doesn't actually have that much to do with testing. So if we say that like testing is all of these things and specification is all of these things, TDD is like that.
Huh.
It's mostly about the specification and a little bit about the testing. So let's talk about what we mean by specification. What should the thing do? We got two different approaches that we can use for specifying how something should work. We can talk about boundaries and stuff, and that is a very useful way to think of it. So let's talk about boundaries. So boundaries are when does something change? So for example, let's say we're doing something with numbers, takes in numbers, does some kind of transformation with the number. Well, you probably want to specify what should happen with -1, 0, +1. You might also want to specify what happens at -infinity and +infinity. There might be different behavior with something more than 1. But there's probably no difference between 2 and 3. Probably no difference between 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. So we're trying to figure out which classes these things fit into. And then we write tests at their boundaries. So like positive numbers and negative numbers might be two different partitions that we work with. Well, right at the boundary of those, we can test at the boundary and then right on either side of it. That probably gives us some idea of what we're working with. And then -infinity and +infinity would be the other side of that boundary. So there's a vocab word for this. It's called equivalence partitioning. They're saying that everything within a partition can be treated as basically equivalent. 105 and 106 are essentially the same thing, so we wouldn't need to test for both of those. But we do want to test at the boundaries of the partitions. And this is where you catch things like off by 1 errors and hinky behavior, as my dad would say, because that's where it hides. Not inside the partitions, right at the boundaries of them.
Do you say like the maximum number that a big int could be?
Yep. Same thing with a string. How does it work with an empty string? That's probably a class with strings. What about a single character? What about characters with spaces in it? So like you look for things like that that come up that are different partitions, and maybe you try to figure out ways to test the boundaries of those. You have an object. Okay, what states can the object be in? What combinations of states can the objects be in? Those are your partitions. So that's boundary testing. That's one approach that we can use for specifying our code. Ask me some questions about that.
Is that like another way of saying edge cases?
No, kind of. These are edge cases. Negative infinity and positive infinity are the edge cases.
Okay.
There's another saying too, where an edge meets an edge. That's a corner case.
Okay.
So if you're dealing with an input that has this and it's relying on some edge state in the application also, you call that a corner case.
So I guess the difference would be like a word having spaces or not versus like how big a word could be.
Right.
Gotcha. So when we're talking specification versus testing, specifying is saying this is what it needs to be, and testing is testing like the way it works.
So testing is like representing the specification in code.
Gotcha.
I just drew a picture here. I like wrote some things on a chart here. That's the specification. The executable specification is the test.
Gotcha.
One of my questions is, I'm wondering if you can kind of give me an example of what you mean by like the state of different classes. Like you said something about like, okay, can like an edge case would be the state of the class or the combo of the state of the class.
So we're doing that with like numbers. Cool. What if we had a student object? So some different states that this could be in could be like has no assignments turned in. Has one and has many. All those might be different states that a student could be in. You could also say that like other states that a student might be in has 0, 1, or many enrollments or something. And where this gets hard, and this is one of the reasons like OOP is such a piece of shit, is like, all right, so if all these are parts of students, then they like, you also want to test combinatorially the combination of all of these states.
Oh.
Yeesh. And that's kind of where this falls apart, because when you're doing that kind of testing, not all of those are practical. Like all you'll do is fucking test all of these possible boundaries. And so you have to introduce some pragmatism in there. You're like, all right, what's likely to happen? What am I actually worried about maybe not working? That's what you test. And like, how do you know? Well, experience. And that's why this is very hard to teach to beginners.
So what you're saying is like in comparison to object-oriented programming, like functional programming, you're testing a function, you're testing that that function does what the function's supposed to do in all the different cases. But in object-oriented programming, you have to test like the specific state and all possible combinations of specific states unless you have like a better foresight based off of experience. Gotcha.
Yep.
That's cool.
And I guess, oh, never mind. I'll just answer my own question. Don't worry about it.
Awesome. Other questions about boundary testing? So this is like still a really useful thing to keep in the back of your head when you're writing tests. I'm always thinking about this. Or what partitions am I working with? So like Damon had asked a couple days ago, how do you know whether or not a test is useless? If it's in the same partition, pretty good chance that it's useless. You only need one representation within a partition. So the other way you could look at specification is by example. So rather than try to like calculate this analytically, you come up with examples that you're going to use, and then you figure out how those should be transformed, what the behavior should be. So those tend to go in the format given some state, some existing state, some background, some whatever. Given that I'm on this page, given that I have a student, given that whatever. When I take some action on it, I call this function, I click this button, I do something, then the new state of the application is this. So this is the existing state, this is the eventual state, this is the action that causes that to go to that.
What is this whole type of testing called when you're choosing it in this order?
Specification by example is like the formal name for it. Broadly, we call this BDD. And that's really like the big difference between TDD. And anytime you see a framework make a distinction between those, that's what they're talking about. TDD is like this style of specification, boundaries. BDD is specification by example. We just come up with examples of how we want the application to behave, the function to behave, the whatever. And then our tests have a one-to-one correlation with the examples that we come up with.
So your givens would be your boundaries.
Your givens would be what state is the application in when I take this action. So given that I have a student enrolled in 2 classes, but with no assignments turned in any of them, when they do this, the new state of the application is, when they submit an assignment, they are still enrolled in both classes and they have 1 assignment turned in the first one. Something like that.
So for testing driven development is, because this is not testing driven development, this is behavioral driven development, but with test driven development is equivalence partitioning pretty much the only way that you're defining your specifications, or is there another like philosophy associated with test driven development?
You're thinking about it a little bit more mathematically in TDD. You're describing, this is the exact same distinction between imperative and declarative programming. This is saying like how all the things should work. This is saying what they do. Don't give a shit about how they work. Okay. And they end up accomplishing the exact same thing. You can use them interchangeably. There's some big benefits to doing the specification by example. Some of them are very human. It's just easier to wrap your head around examples than it is to wrap your head around formulas. That's just the truth of the matter. More importantly, it's easier to communicate with your non-technical stakeholders through examples. They don't understand this shit. This is math stuff. They absolutely understand examples. And this is where like BDD even encompasses more than TDD does. So if that's TDD, BDD isn't a replacement for it, it's an extension of it. BDD also includes these conversations you're having with the stakeholders. So as you're having these conversations with your very non-technical folks, you go, okay, so just so I'm understanding, given that the app is like this, when I do this, you want it to do this. Those conversations are part of the cycle. And I think all of you have seen the gherkin tests on the hike thing. That's what this is. So as we're having these conversations, I'm like taking notes or whatever, and those notes become the tests.
So, in an example, like would TDD ever, or could you give an example of when TDD will be useful for any end-to-end testing? Because right now I'm thinking it doesn't fit, right?
No, like I think BDD is the superior approach for end-to-end testing.
So you could do TDD, but BDD just makes more sense.
Yeah, so the TDD approach to end-to-end would be like finding boundaries. When I click this button once, when I click this button infinity times, like that sort of stuff. Exploring every possible thing on the page and specifying how it should work. Just go off of examples. How's it actually getting used?
Mm-hmm.
And then what ends up happening is if you do double loop testing, which we'll talk about later, as you get closer down to the metal, that's where it starts looking more like this. Because like you very well might want to boundary test like your, especially like utility functions and stuff, where you don't know exactly how they're going to get used. Boundary testing still has a place in that.
Gotcha.
But
a good example
driven by the behaviors ultimately up high.
Yeah, that example would have been kind of what we were doing with that search that Ahmed was trying to fix, right? Because it was tested based on the behavior that's happening, but we did have to throw some boundaries in there to see what happens when there's spaces, what happens when there's dashes or whatever the case may be.
And so that turns into like a bug is a missing example. It's a case that you didn't think of. But rather than thinking of that mathematically, you come up with the concrete example of why it wouldn't work, which it sounds like that's exactly what you guys did when you fixed that space issue. So in case anybody hasn't seen
it really feels like the givens on the BDD are your boundaries. Like you said, like this is given these boundaries, this is I expect it to work in these ways.
So here's the gherkin test for that video thing. There's the given. Given that I'm on this page, so that means I don't have to also navigate to the page in the tests. Given a student is on the page, when they search for this, then only this many are shown, and only videos with that title are shown. And then we can come up with all these examples for how that should be represented. We have a bug. That means that we were missing an example, like one with a space in it.
How would you go about timing on this thing, right? Like given the students on the videos page, how do you account for networks and stuff like that? Like how long is it going to take to get there? Like what is the case that happens when they try to go here but they can't connect or something like that?
So there's a couple different approaches you could take to this. The way that this one works, so this one stubs out the back end. This is saying, all right, when it makes a request to videos, don't actually honor the request. Just immediately respond with this fixture. So that speeds up the tests. And like, if you're not also testing the back end, it just gives you a narrower thing to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is now you're not actually testing the entire workflow. So you're not testing things like network speed and whatever else. But, and so like, you might also want to have those. And so like, here's a good like heuristic that I learned kind of recently is you could say, a test should only fail for one reason. So it should fail because like the logic is bad or the network is down. But if like the network is down, one test should fail, not every test. And so you have like one actual end-to-end test and then you fake it out for all the other ones. And so you still know if like there's something fucked up with the network, but you've decoupled like your logic testing from that also.
Gotcha.
Is that in all concept? Like if you're doing behavioral, if you're doing test-driven development, in all of those should tests only fail from one thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Also, the thing I just described is the difference between an integration test and an end-to-end test, by the way.
Because that was going to be my question too, John. I was wondering, like, would network be considered a boundary, right, to your test or not?
Yes.
Hmm.
So that is something that like you generally don't want to test. And let's talk about the pyramid for a sec.
Hmm.
So in unit tests, like units are very vaguely defined. It doesn't mean function. It doesn't mean class. It often means function, though. It often means class. It's like one isolatable chunk of the application that only like really does one thing. But there are some rules for things that are not units. Anything that works over a network, not a unit test. Anything that works with a file system, not a unit test. Things that that operate across those kinds of boundaries, not unit tests. So you can still check the logic of something that needs to interact over a network, but you fake it out.
Can you do asynchronous unit testing? Like both of the things that you just described, the only reason why I thought of that is because they seem to be asynchronous tasks, right?
That's not why, but that's a pretty good sign that maybe it's not a unit.
Okay.
Because unit tests are also supposed to be fast as shit, and asynchronous stuff often isn't.
Can you also, as another approach, just make that a separate test?
You could, yeah. So if you test all of your logic by faking out a network or a file system or whatever in your unit tests, this is going back to that, well, what if the file system is fucked up? That's the integration test. You're testing how your units integrate with each other and integrate with outside of your application, stuff you don't control.
Okay, so can I make an example just to clarify something? I made like a library the other day, that not a library, but just like a function that basically parses a matrix out of a hacker rank text file. Okay, so the unit testing, I could do unit testing there, and the unit testing would check the output of like a string input. And then the integration testing would be like, okay, does this thing grab a file if I put in this file path?
Yep. And then the end-to-end test would be, how does this actually get used? Does it get used in a browser? Cool. Operate it through the browser. It's a command line app. Awesome. Like fire up a fake terminal, call the function. But like an end-to-end test usually has no idea how the solution is implemented. It could all be hard code. It could be fake. Who fucking knows? But you're in an end-to-end test, you're usually operating it the way that a user would.
Hey, Colton just sent me a message that his partners are not responding.
Fucking A.
Do you want me to hop on a call with him?
Yeah, go ahead and knock that out.
All right, I'll be back.
So these are also called UI tests. Sometimes people make a distinction between an end-to-end and a UI test. The language around all this stuff is super fucking vague. Like it's not. So if you're fuzzy on these, it's because the industry is fuzzy on these. Don't worry too much about it.
Gotcha. I guess one of my concerns too is like making a test too big. When is it like the test is too bulky that you're trying to incorporate too many things?
Like you can look at the size of the actual test code. Test code shouldn't get that big. If it's more than like, a lot of test code should be like 3 or 4 lines. If it's more than like a page, you're probably doing too much shit. And so one of the ways you can get around that is like, all right, if there's a whole bunch of setup that you need to do before you can actually run the test, just make that a state. Right? Cool, given that I did all that setup. And so like this one in particular, given a student is on the videos page, does the work of stubbing out that backend and then sends the browser to that page. And now I can just say, all right, assuming I'm there already, when I do this, then this should happen.
Nice. It kind of seems to me like refactoring. You take like this function that does 10 things and you break each thing out into its own test.
Correct. And a lot of this is like doing that ahead of time as part of the specification. So it's like prefactoring. I like that. How can I decompose this problem into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces and then specify the behavior of those small pieces? And so double loop testing, which kind of goes hand in hand with BDD, is this is the feature that I'm actually trying to get done. It might be huge. It might have like a lot of different pieces to it. So I make these smaller tests that get me one step closer to having that done. And those might also have their own smaller tests. The idea is that whenever the smallest level of this is done, whenever those tests pass, then the next level passes, and then the feature passes. But this was one of the most eye-opening things to me when I was learning this, was the difference between these tests and these tests. Start with the big one. What are you trying to get done? These are the things that like are on the code wars things, those big examples. That's how you know that the feature works. But you take all these smaller and smaller steps to get there. And so as you're going through this, you go, oh, fuck, man, I got to write some code to make that work. All right, I can write that code separately from the rest of this feature. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to skip these tests. And then I'm going to just worry about this smaller piece of it. Can I test drive that? And then sometimes that's too big. And so you go, okay, I need to decompose that a little bit more. And so I'm going to pause this test, skip it, whatever else, and try to decompose that down smaller. You can do that as many times as you need to till you get to like an actual chunk of functionality that you can drive in like minutes.
Right. It's kind of like breaking down your thin vertical slices. Like if you say
Yes.
your feature is login, well, it's like, what
Yes.
are, I need a user to have a secure password. I need to have a custom route, like blah, blah,
Totally.
blah.
Exactly. So this feature test might be, given that I'm on the login page, when I enter this into the username field and this into the password field and hit enter, then I should see my profile page. So that's this giant feature page.
Mhm.
And then the smaller things in there might be like, okay, can I actually navigate to a login page? Like, does one exist? All right, so that's a smaller thing. Can I get that to pass? I was like, all right, can I fill out this form? No, maybe that's a smaller part of that also. And then you go, okay, can I get a token to come back over like a fake network? So if I did a post request to this URL with this username and password, can I make it give me a token back? So like it's little steps like that that get you one step closer. And so our feature, we really don't want to have like, I don't want to go down the road. This can be pretty big, the feature. And then we want to keep using tests to get it smaller and smaller and smaller.
So when you're using I'm going to ask a question, and also I should probably bring up the Colton thing. But so when you're using a framework like Cypress, you're kind of saying that like, oh, okay, I have a feature. That feature is like BDD. And then I can make subtests on that are not BDD. And do you still use the same testing library? Like, would you still use Cypress to do the integration testing, or like, does that just depend?
But it's not a very good tool for it.
Gotcha. Okay.
I would still have a separate like Jest or something like that for your unit tests, but you could technically run unit tests in Cypress.
Okay, that makes sense. I probably should talk about the Colton situation real quick. Coulter's like not here today, apparently. So I don't know why. He didn't tell anybody, but he's not here. Like, I know he's been a pretty good student so far. I asked if Brian would check on him. I slacked him. But Coulter's not here. I told Colton like apparently like can pass the code challenge. Like I spoke to him and it sounds like he was able to do everything on the code challenge. So I just told him and Reed to just work on a JavaScript full stack project. And if Coulter comes through later, he'll hop in on their project.
Cool.
So, all right, cool.
That works and is annoying. Cool. So, oh shit, that's in the video. Well, whatever. All right, so
Oh, sorry.
other questions about double loop testing?
Oh, I didn't know this was called double loop testing.
Gotcha. So double loop is the idea that within each loop, you're doing other loops inside of it. So kind of like testing of being able to enter username and password. One of those loops could be like, well, what if that username already exists?
Yeah, exactly. And so in part because of that, this outer loop doesn't need to cover every possible example. You don't need to do the boundaries with those outside tests because a lot of those boundary cases get covered in the smaller tests.
Gotcha. And then you can reuse it kind of, you're like given this, and then you just
Now you can use some of those things as like states. And this is like how test refactoring works. All right, so that's a state. Neat. Well, now it doesn't actually need to be its own separate test, because if it's a state and we use that state, all that gets exercised all the time anyway. So it doesn't need to also be a test.
So let's say, like, can we just take the example that we did with the search parameter thing, right? So we create, well, I guess Ahmed and Damon created the BDD test in Gherkin, and that said, when I do these set of things, this is what should happen as a user. Then if we wanted to, we could go in and be like, okay, let me test this function that parses this string, and that would be a double loop test, because inside of that BDD test, I check to make sure that this function outputs what it's supposed to.
Yep. If that function is getting you one step closer to passing the outer test, yep.
Okay. That's cool.
It is cool. And like, you could give this to Brian or Josh. Like, there's nothing like super technical about any of this. And if they can pattern match it, they can write these fucking examples themselves. That's powerful. That's how you get rid of this goofy handoff between your like users and analysts and programmers and whatever else. These are all speaking the same language. And these directly translate, like these are looking for these functions here. So that boundary is fucking cool. It makes no daylight between the non-technical language and the technical language.
So your outer loop is given as soon as on the videos page, and your two inner loops are searching by title or searching by tag name, even though the whens are the same.
No, this whole thing is the outer loop. The inner loop would be something like, oops, not that. All right, so this is an outer loop test. All of these are.
Mm-hmm.
So I go, all right, well, I should get, so this is counting the number of videos. Neat. How am I going to get it to do that? So like, I don't think this actually has inner loop tests, but if it did, you'd go, all right, what is the computed property that I can write in that component that would do this correctly? So like in this example, it would be, so the inner loop would be things like writing the tests for this. You're like, okay, well, what would get me one step closer to being able to make this like very user-centric thing pass is I have this filter IDs thing. So if the state of this component is it's got these videos loaded up or they're in store or whatever else, and the state of the search term, if I pass that prop in and I pass that array in, what will this computed property return? That would be like an inner test. And then let's say I didn't have a map or a sum function in there. I go, okay, well, I need to write a map function that can iterate over this array and transform it. So I'm going to go one level in from that and make a test for the map function. That would be like 3 levels of loops.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So where do these tests live, I guess, is part of my confusion, right? So does the test live inside of the outer loop, or does it live somewhere else in the code that says, like, I guess that's what I'm confused. Like, let's say you were to test one of these computer properties, where would that test live?
In the like test folder. It's not like with the Cypress test. Like
Okay.
that part of it doesn't matter really. It's just for you. So if like where these actually live is, so this is the root directory, the front end, and this test folder, there's the unit, or there's the end-to-end test, there's the unit tests. And so like this is a unit test that I wrote. This was Ahmed and I we were testing the timing or something on it. Oh, we're trying to see if it could do it quickly. And so what we were testing is, all right, if I type this, and then I type that, and then I type that, it shouldn't actually trigger the search until it waits for some amount of time. So like what we did is we faked out the timers, like the system clock for this, and then manually manipulated it so that it's typing these things in, and then it waits a second and then verifies that it actually did the calculation.
But how are you getting this to run inside of another loop is what I'm saying. Like,
no, the loop is process. The loop is just how you're working. It's not technical.
Oh, okay. I thought you literally meant like you run a Cypress loop and then inside of that Cypress loop, it calls on different units.
This entire structure happens in your head.
Okay. All right. That makes a lot more sense now.
Other questions?
So the examples in that, is it like the Gherkin test? Yeah. Those are just cases like that you would consider different partitions, but not necessarily boundaries.
Yes. Cool. That is how you would select something to be an example. And so if we look at what we have here, oh, shit, there it is. What's going on? All right, fuck that. So like this one has a capital letter. This one's all lowercase. This one's a single letter. This one has a space. This one has multiple words with no space. So each of those would be a partition.
So partitioning is not just a test-driven development concept, it's also behavior-driven.
Okay. It's a testing, it's like a general testing idea, but it has to do with whether or not you, like the partitions are driving the analysis and the specification, or if the examples are.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. That makes a lot of sense.
Other questions?
So then in BDD, partitioning is not driving, but you kind of just bear it in mind when you're writing your tests. Does that make sense?
When you're coming up with examples. And not everything has like a table of examples like this. So like other things, it's like this one. This one doesn't have examples. Like, or rather, it doesn't have a table of examples. So, or this one, if a teacher, meaning someone who's like logged in, is on the resources page, when they edit the resource, the updated one shows up on this page. There's no partitions or boundaries or anything for that, but it is an example of something that a student or a teacher should be able to do. So that's BDD. We also have things like search is a perfect example where we have different combinations of behaviors and shit that we want. So keeping things like boundaries and partitions in mind with this helps us come up with effective examples.
Mhm.
But while we would never want to duplicate partition or boundary tests in like strict TDD, with this is part of our documentation also. And so if like having a repeated thing in there helped a non-technical stakeholder understand it better, fuck it, man, put it in there.
For the other example where you don't have multiple partitions or boundaries, how would you go about writing a test, like a unit test for that?
So like these also map directly to tests. So when the teacher edits a resource is going to be here. So that's the Cypress test for this. That's the outer loop. You fake out a server, and then when you click this button and you pick that thing and then fill that out and then fill that out and then click that out and you wait for this thing to happen, then the updated resource shows up on the page. That means that that should have that thing and that should have that thing and that should have that thing. So you're translating the non-technical language into the technical language. So Brian would understand that the teacher edits a resource. Well, what does it mean for a teacher to edit a resource? Well, here's a more specific example. And then you go, all right, well, that's a lot. So what are the things, and like you would write all of this before there even is like an edit button. You go, all right, I will know that this works when all of these things kind of happen. So this is also why this is really part of like the specification part, because you're choosing what these things are called. You're choosing what the elements are. You're also designing a solution as you're doing this. But and this is also why it relies on experience a little bit too, is like, what would a good finished code look like for this? I'm not specifying really how any of these things work, but I'm saying there should be a select thing. So, all right, it's a dropdown. It's going to have that on it. I am specifying that it has an input. I am specifying that you're going to click a button. That's an appropriate level for that. So my next loop in might be something like, all right, well, I probably need some kind of like component that all of this lives in. It's like, all right, well, how does that component work? Well, it's got 3 fields and it's got this and this and this. So I might write a bunch of tests that don't consider any of this server stuff or any of the like overall workflow kinds of things. All it is specifying how that component should work. And that might be a little loop inside of that. And then I might zoom back out again and go, all right, so all that kind of works. Well, what happens when I click the button? Well, that should fire off a network request that does whatever the fuck. And that's how you're getting back up to that. I think one of the biggest traps in doing something like this is expecting it to be comprehensive too. So like I gave you a hypothetical example of that. That's not how I did it. I just used this. If in the process of doing this, I was like, it has been too long since I've seen a green test. Like, I feel like I'm kind of working myself in circles. Maybe that's when I add the next test in. But like, they're for you. We're not trying to make the TDD gods happy. We're trying to make our development cycles more productive. And so as you're going through this, you'll notice like, this feels like I'm biting off too big a bite. So you make it smaller with some smaller tests. Or like I've been doing some Code Wars stuff at night lately, and I'll often write little tests for myself to help me like make smaller functions and stuff. And then as I'm working through it, I might go, these aren't actually helping me anymore. And so then you delete them. They're fucking Kleenex. Like it gets really hard when you're starting with testing because you're like, I put so much effort into learning how to fucking write these. You want me to delete a test? And like you do it all the time. Like a lot of times it's just scaffolding as you're figuring something out. But you can contrast like doing that with tests versus doing that with console logs. It's like test people like to talk shit about console log driven development. And it's really just replacing that. It's automating your console logs a little bit more.
I guess that's where the experience comes in on like how deep into these loops you need to go. Because at some level, you're just kind of spinning your wheels. And you're not getting that much benefit from the testing.
Yeah, definitely. Takes practice. And also this is another thing that was not super clear to me when I was learning this stuff. It can be a two-way conversation. It's not like the thing that I actually wrote for this when I wrote this test first probably wasn't exactly this. It's probably in the ballpark. But as I was working through the solution, you see things, you're like, I don't like that at all. That sucks. Or like, I can come up with a better name than that. Or like, no, the workflow should actually be this. That's fine. Go back and fix your test. Like the discovery kind of happens on both sides of it, both when you're specifying it as you're working it. And since you control both of those, somebody didn't give you these tests, then like just update the test to match whatever your like evolving understanding of the problem is. Totally allowed. Other questions? Cool. I want to let's lock this in a little bit before we start getting our hands dirty. We've been getting our brains dirty. So I would like each of you to Slack me a description. All right, two questions. What is test-driven development? What is behavior-driven development? Give me your best explanations for both of those things. Let's take a couple minutes. Go. Another minute. All right, Slack me what you got. Ahmed, I really like your answer. Would you read it out loud, please?
BED compared to TDD. I put BED as kind of the story of user interaction, like how someone would use it. So what happens and what is expected to occur. And TDD is more focused on the exact inputs and outputs. So more of how it happens. How does the code act given certain parameters? More technical.
Excellent. So one thing that was missing from everybody's answers about BDD is it's not just the testing part. It's all, and that's also true with TDD. TDD stretches back into our analysis and partially into our design of solutions also, because if we're writing the test first, we have to know what victory looks like, which means we need to, at a minimum, specify what the API for whatever this shit is. If it's a function, what does it take in? What does it take out? Like you're making those choices before you write any code. If it's an interface, are there buttons? Are there drop downs? Are there inputs? Like what are the things that people do? And then BDD also stretches back to your conversations. Those are part of behavior-driven development, is generating this shared understanding with your stakeholders. All right, excellent. Any last questions before we start actually writing some tests? Cool. So let's see. One quick note I want to make on testing frameworks and assertions. So I wrote a whole thing on that thing I was slacking out. It was testing. So I did. So I talked about assertion a little bit. The kinds of things you do on Code Wars almost always are just using something like Node's assert module. If all you ever know about those is like assert.equal, assert.deep equal, and assert.ok, that's fine. Like that's enough in your tool belt for like pretty much all TDD stuff. Does this equal this? Or is it truthy? If that's all you have, like you're in fine shape. Now, like the reason we have entire libraries around these things is there's also like way more robust language that we can use, and that typically gets associated with BDD. One of the reasons that we tend to do things like assert greater than, or will eventually be greater than, or resolves to, or like a lot of these other things is like your tests are code. And so if you start writing out implementations for these, all right, well, now you got to write tests for your fucking tests. So Jest in particular, I think, so like that's an example of what that might look like. I think Jest does the best job of this, which is made. Maybe I haven't pushed this up yet. Check. There we go. So Jest has these functions like to be or to have been called times. They end up kind of reading like sentences, which is very BDD-ish. But more importantly, they abstract away all of this logic so that you're not potentially making logic errors in your tests also. That's why it's worth learning those. It like Jest isn't actually that big. These are all of the different assertions that you can do in Jest. It's not a ton of them. And then in Cypress, Cypress uses the chai one. So that is these kinds of things. To.deep.equal. There's a whole grammar around it, which it's not super hard to learn, but it's not immediately intuitive how it works. And the here's a list of all of them. But like the 10,000 foot view is there's three kinds of words that you use in those. There's assertions like equal that actually like assert something. There's modifiers like not that just invert whatever the result of a test is. And then there's these chainers. The chainers don't actually do anything. All they do is make it read more like a sentence. So yeah, it negates all assertions that follow it in the chain, for example. I think that the one on the Cypress side is actually easier to read. It's literally using chai, so it's the same thing, but this one. Exact same stuff, but it likewise just keeps you from writing out logic for all of this stuff that you could get wrong. Cool. So those are assertions. To start with, if all you roll with is stuff like assert equals, or in Jest, like to equal or to be, like that's a fine place to start. But Jest in particular has a really good set of matchers that do a lot of heavy lifting for you. Cool. So with that in mind, let's do some testing. So I'd like you to pull open a terminal. All right, so we've got an empty folder here. I think one of the reasons that people get stuck with testing is that they're too slow at getting the testing set up. And so it's frustrating, and so they don't do it very much. So I'd like us to set up a smoke test 3 times with Jest, just so we get a little bit of muscle memory on it. The steps, I want you to npm init-y. Just give yourself a package JSON. And then I want you to install Jest. You can do it as a development dependency if you want, but in 2020, all that's kind of a murky area. We're going to install Jest.
Man, I never knew those chainers didn't do anything.
Yep, nothing.
It's like when we say .to include, it's the same as .include.
Correct. Cool. So, all right. So we have that installed. Now it's going to look by default for things in a folder called tests. So let's make that folder. And then the other thing that Jest does by default is it's expecting it's expecting your test to end with .spec.js. So we can do something like tests smoke.spec.js. Cool. And then go into your package JSON file, and it gave you this empty testing thing. We can just replace that with Jest, like that. And you should be able to run npm test now and see that error. Take a sec, make sure you get that far.
What did you put in your package JSON again? For test. Just.
Yep. It's configurable. You can make it watch stuff. You can do all sorts of stuff, but just the basic command, just. Cool. So now it's mad at us because our suite doesn't contain a test. Let's give it a test. If you go into that smoke test, the lightest thing you could probably do is just test. Give it a name. And then, so that's like our test setup. We need a system to test. It's like, that's how they refer to it in the literature, is a system under test. So we would say something like, my app is in an app.js file or whatever. And so maybe we assert that we expect app to exist. To exist is one of the Jest matchers. And then if we run this, it fails because it doesn't exist. If I make an app.js now, and run that again, it says to exist actually isn't a function. All right, hang on. Just matchers. To be defined. There we go. Cool. What happens now? Whoop. Probably wasn't a very good one. That's exactly, by the way, why we do these like falsified tests up front, so that we make sure that something like that doesn't happen. Say to be truthy. Oh, how did that pass?
You gotta put a .js on there, maybe?
No, that's not it. It does. Node doesn't care about that.
Doesn't matter.
What if I module.exports false? There we go. Finally. Man, now I'm kind of wondering, and here's a good example of how we can use the testing framework. I'm kind of wondering why is it should have been like undefined or something like that, right? So maybe I go, well, what the fuck is it? I have my editor, I have my tests. If I npm test over here, cool. And if I do nothing, it passes still. So you can put a console log in there and like, let's see what it actually is. But we're looking at that through the testing framework. Ah, that's why. What is it?
The object.
It comes back as the module object. I don't think that would have happened with import export. That's a require specific thing. So now our smoke test could be something like, let's see, is there an empty?
Why is it just hanging? I can't even get the jest stuff to pop up.
Uh-oh. We'll take a look at that in a sec.
It's just hanging.
Mine didn't pass the test, but when I did const app equals require, it just breaks. Like it doesn't even run the test, I don't think.
We'll take a look at all of that.
You can use to contain.
We could. We could also say like something more specific, like app dot whatever to be defined. That's fine. Then we can take that console log out. And then we have a failing test. And we can make it pass with module.exports. And now we've got a passing test.
Gotcha. Can you tell your test to print something out? Kind of like when it failed, it said, I got this.
Yep. Ooh, I don't know if you can do that with jest. It's an anti-pattern. Like a lot of assertion libraries will let you write custom assertions for your failures. Make those separate tests. So like this means that like whatever the shit isn't. So if you have some other thing that you want to come out, put it there instead.
Gotcha.
Okay, let's do some debugging. Damon, yours is hanging?
Yeah, it's just hanging. It runs jest, but here, I'll show you what it looks like. So once I npm test, it just stops there.
Okay, kill that. Give me an ls. Give me an ls tests. Cool. Show me your smoke.spec.js file.
It was also doing
It's because you're returning it. You're doing that all in one line. There's all kinds of like weird fucky stuff with that in testing. Try that now.
Yeah. So just for reference, it was doing this too before I even wrote the smoke.spec.
Oh, que interesante.
And if I show you my package JSON, it was just jest, right?
Yep.
I don't know, maybe Zoom calling it down.
Now we have a good old fashioned mystery. All right, let me see your smoke spec again. Test smoke spec app to be true.
Oops.
Let me see your app. Okay. Let me see your node version.
Node version?
Yeah. See, it was 14.4, one of the fucked up ones.
Mine's 14.13. I don't know.
See, I'm on 12.19.
Yeah, I'm on 12.12.
All right, so just to isolate this a little bit, install 12.19 real quick.
Can I do that with NVM?
Yep.
NVM, I don't remember. Is it install?
Yep.
And at symbol.
No, just 12.19. No node.
Gotcha. No.
Don't put the let it figure out whatever the patch is. Yeah, just run that. All right, and since this is a different version, lock files and node modules are all version specific, so blow those out and reinstall.
Package dash lock and
Cool. Now reinstall. All right, now try your npm test. Huh. How strange. All right, I want to try something else. Go ahead and kill that. Run npx jest. Still hangs. Okay, kill that. Let's see. All right. Time to look at Stack Overflow. Just hanging. Just hangs indefinitely, runs no tests. Turned out to be a caching problem. Do a give me a jest-v. Sorry, npx jest-v. Who can tell me why I had to have him use npx for that?
not globally installed.
It's not globally installed.
Which
It
crazy.
is installed to the shit though. Can anybody tell me what folder the like actual file that's being run is in?
Node modules.
Not node modules. It's in there, but it's in a specific folder in there.
The jest folder.
Nope. Good guess.
I don't know.
Got to be in the npm folder then, if there is one.
Nope.
No.
Do you have Ranger installed?
I should. I think so. Nope.
Do a brew install Ranger.
I also did globally install Jest because I thought that might have been the problem. So I'm actually confused.
But now you're on a different version of Node, so
Yeah.
different global installs.
Wait, Ranger is a dependency for Jest?
No,
Oh, I
it's
was
just
like,
going to help us do some exploring.
gotcha.
Shallow clone. Huh?
All right. So now run Ranger. All right. So if you go into the node modules folder, press ZH. That's going to show your hidden files. That .bin folder. If you go in there, those are all the commands that you can run with npx.
Gotcha.
So whenever you npx anything, it's looking in that folder. Pretty cool, huh?
Yeah.
All right, you can press Q to get out of there. All right, cool. So this says it's a caching issue. So if you do jest and then -- clear cache, camel cased.
Camel.
Yep. Give it a go. Hey, cool. Now do your npm test. You're beautiful.
There you go. Nice. How was it caching if I never even used? No, I guess I must have used.
You've used just before somewhere, and it got all fucky.
Thank you.
All right, who else is having problems? Cool. Build and burn. Do it 2 more times. I can't wait for you to find out. All right, I'm going to give you a clue that has nothing to do with the medical box. Yeah, maybe. Or it might be doing forever. Sorry. That's fine. That's about nature. There you go. So as you're doing this, something to keep in mind. This is the exact same process for Mocha. It's actually the same process for Jasmine too. The difference is if we're doing Mocha, you would also install Chai, and you would also install Sign-On, and you would also install a bunch of plugins for Chai to make it work better with promises. All like the design goal of Jest was just all of those, and it's like a Mocha and Chai instance that somebody else set up for you really nice. And it also has a cool snapshot testing feature. So they solve the exact same problem. They solve it in kind of the same way, but just as an overall a much nicer experience.
What exactly is snapshot testing? I've heard that a few times before.
So snapshot testing is rendering like a component, for example, in a browser, like kind of in a fake browser, taking a screenshot of it, and then in the future, comparing future test runs like pixel to pixel to make sure that your UI didn't change.
Dang it. Oh, Lord.
I think one of my favorite things about writing tests is that I know I wrote it wrong if it fails.
Yeah.
There's no like, huh, did that work just by chance? It's like, nope. Nothing wrong.
There it goes. Oh, I downloaded this new file browser today and it's fucking me up for a second.
Okay, so hopefully everybody's getting pretty fast at this. I'm going to do it one more time myself. npm init y npm install jest. mcdir tests, touch tests, smoke.spec.js. Let's edit the package JSON. And test it. Beautiful. So I'm going to make a test here I will require in my app, and I expect that app not to equal an empty object. And if I run it, it failed because it couldn't find the module. So I make the module and I run it again. And it fails because it was supposed to not be an empty object, and it's an empty object. So I go over to that app file, I module.export, plural. Something that isn't that, passing test. Cool. Any questions about setting up testing on something? Just getting fast at that makes all the difference in the world.
The dot not to equal,
Mm-hmm.
is that maybe a bad comparison because of the fact that two objects technically don't equal each other anyways in JavaScript? Or is
That's to equal is just deep equality. Shallow equality is to be.
Oh, to equal is deep and to be is shallow. Okay. Thank you. So the deep equals is like a mocha thing.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I'm
It's a chai thing.
chai thing. Okay.
One more note on assertions. All an assertion is something that throws an error. Like the way a testing framework works is whatever in here, if it throws an error, it didn't pass the test. If it does throw an error, it did pass the test. That's it. So assertion libraries are just different ways to make things throw errors. Cool. So let's take Ahmed's. Oh, okay. One more thing I want to talk about with this, because it's the same with Jest and Mocha and like almost all testing frameworks anymore. So I called this test. You've probably seen describe and it before.
Yeah, RSpec uses describing it also.
RSpec created that style.
Hmm.
So you've seen describe in it, and we can actually do the exact same shit with that. That works too. Describe is a way to group tests, and you can just arbitrarily keep nesting those all the way down. It is a way to describe a test. They just call it it because it makes it read more like a sentence. So like it does something. It puts you in the right mindset for like how this test should be structured. But those are the BDD syntax. You can also do context and test. Exact same thing. They're synonyms.
What was the original one you had? Was it just an it on the surface?
It was just test on the surface. They don't need to be in describes. You can just have its or test floating around wherever if you want.
Okay. All right, that makes sense.
I tend to use context and test more when I'm doing Code Wars style, very TDD-ish kinds of things where I'm thinking about boundaries and stuff. But this more BDD style syntax, I probably use that higher up, narrower I get. They don't always need to be grouped. So
Gotcha.
you can just use test for that.
And it likes all of this language, works totally fine in Jest.
Mm-hmm.
That's crazy.
I tried context and it says context is not defined.
Oh, really? Maybe that's try it. What? Did they take it out of Mocha? Whoa. Maybe they took it out of. Here it is. Why was context removed in a point release? There you go. Unused.
Apparently not by that person.
Well, there you go. Yeah, you can get it back with that. I was on vacation. Didn't think it was a big deal. See, like student projects, man. It's all open source is. It's all just people doing student projects arguing with each other. If you'd like to fucking help. So there you go.
Gotcha.
Looks like they did keep test though.
You can throw test blocks inside of describes too, like mix and match.
Yep. Correct.
This is not a TDD related question, but my iTerm won't let me like scroll inside of it, or it's weird with Vim. I'm curious if you know a fix for that.
Oh yeah, you can't. There's no scrolling in. Like, are you in Tmux?
Actually, I'm not in Tmux, and it's still fucking up, but it also always fucks up when I'm in Tmux, no matter which terminal I'm in. I can scroll through terminal, but I can't through iTerm.
Are you mean scrolling in Vim or just on the terminal?
Well, in Vim, I use this special terminal called FlowTerm, but just scrolling in Vim
Jesus
as well.
Christ, John. So many,
In general,
so many layers
when I
on
scroll-
layers on layers.
In general, when I scroll in Vim, it scrolls up to something that's not like scrolling.
Yeah,
up
it's because
inside
you're
of Vim.
super not supposed to. Like, there's all kinds of magic happening because, like, there is no scrolling really. Like, it's all just one thing that's constantly being repainted. And so when you scroll, it's trying to scroll like your regular iTerm, not within the application. Command line applications don't have any concept of scrolling.
Is there a way to, in a terminal, like without scrolling with a mouse or anything like that, just keep going up to see input?
Kind of like there isn't Tmux. So like if we had a Tmux session going and I had, let's see, do that a couple times. So you can, there's a mode that lets you use Vim commands to scroll up and down your terminal like that.
Oh,
Like that's how that would be done.
okay.
Cool. Any other questions about how we can name and group stuff for our test runner? Cool. So I want to, the Morse code thing that Ahmed posted, it's pretty good. I don't want to do it in Code Wars though. So if you didn't get a chance to take a look at it, it's a Morse code decoder. So the input is some Morse code stuff, including like a new word, or sorry, is a new word or new space? There, within it, like the spaces are meaningful. There we go. A space is used to separate characters and 3 spaces is used to separate words. And there's some like special codes too that just get translated directly and they don't have spaces in them. All right, so that's the thing we're supposed to write. And they gave us some tests. We're going to do it all ourselves. So well, what I do want to keep though is they gave you a table with all the Morse code things in them already. So we do want to pinch that. I'm going to post this, and I'm going to post this in chat for, I'll post it in chat for here. All right, so that's what we got there. And what we want to do is write some tests for this. So the first thing that we want to do is like, we're working outside in. What's our highest level test that we could write that lets us know that like this is a success. Think to yourself for a second. Christine, give me an idea.
You put in an input, you get an output.
Yeah, but like what input, what output?
Sorry, I didn't read the problem. I'm still doing that.
Cool. So it's a Morse code decoder. So we give it Morse code and it outputs the regular Roman text for it. So how would we know that we were done?
So it's going to return a string.
Yep. Give me an example.
So if the input is a string of like one Morse code symbol, it'll return a string of one character.
Like, so that's probably going to be one of our inner tests that gets us closer. Specification by example. So give me an example of something that we would translate from Morse code.
We can pick the first character, right?
How about just Christine?
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
like Christine rocks. Maybe something with like a space in it. If we put in the Morse code, go ahead.
From a string to Morse code or the other way around?
Other way around.
Okay, from Morse code to a string.
Yeah. Except your name's too long. I don't want to do it that way.
Test.
Test. Why not?
Yeah.
If we did something like test works.
They have a string already evaluated in the problem statement. They have like a Hey Jude string.
Right, but like we're not doing this on Code Wars.
Okay, sorry, my bad. I just okay, that makes sense. My bad.
So we go, all right. So we had Kyle rocks. If we passed the Morse code representation of that in and got Kyle rocks back, we would assume it worked. That's where we want to start with this. And it's very tempting to go exactly where you went, which is like, but maybe a smaller one. And like, what are the boundaries on it? What's the technical implementation of this going to be? Go all the way out. What would you do how would you eventually test this when you thought you had it finished that would make you feel like, cool, it worked? Does that need to be more than one thing? Cool, then what would those things be? But the TDD mindset is figuring that out before you write a single line of code.
So step one would be like, rather than thinking about the parts, I think, what is the output of this total function? What's the input of this total function? But this is BDD right now, not TDD?
It's kind of in the boundary because like it would be a little bit more BDD-ish if we were also making like a browser app that,
Gotcha.
All right, so when they, how do they enter the Morse code in? Do they like tap it? Do they enter the shit in? So like in the conversations that we have with our stakeholders around like how that app should work, but then as part of that conversation, it would be things like, all right, so you're telling me if I tap this button like this and like this and like this, the thing that should come out is Kyle rocks or Hey Jude or whatever. All right, neat. And you're also telling me that if it works like this and this and this, then I would see this back. So that all of that stuff is the BDD part of it. And then when we're down at the level of, all right, so then we have this function that takes in these things and returns this thing, we're getting more into TDD-ish territory.
Okay.
So like,
remember, BDD doesn't replace TDD; it extends it.
So like the test cases I would use are like a phrase, a word with a symbol, since they have symbols, and like they has like SOS, so like an acronym.
Yeah, one of their like special character-y kinds of things.
Mhm.
And those end up kind of being partitions, right? Because if it works with Kyle, it probably works with Damon, probably works with Ahmed, probably works with Christine. But if we were thinking of this without BDD in mind, we would probably do things like A, B, A space B, like stuff that like nobody's actually, doesn't actually illustrate how it works particularly well, but it is working with these boundaries. Since we're BDDing, we use things like Hey Jude, Kyle Rocks, SOS, like that sort of thing. Other questions about this approach? Oh, cool. This is the instructors. Look at what say yo, holy crap, you're heavy now.
Hey.
Hey,
Here, I'll stop screen sharing so they can see you.
There we go.
what's up?
What's going on, buddy?
What do you want to tell them? Awesome. You guys want to tell Duncan something?
Oh man, I wish I had my master sword with me.
Awesome. Are you going to go out and go skating or something? Oh, school's starting. All right.
Oh,
Yes, you can have a minute.
I got
So,
man.
So Brian, Brian dropped this off yesterday. All of those disgusting ass mints. Because like my kids have been asking about these for months. When are you going to get more of those mints? Well,
Only people who liked them.
yeah, no kidding. All right, so that high level, that's where we want to go with this, right? So what's the test that I write?
a test and say given. What we do? I guess we wouldn't do it given here, right? We could.
Wouldn't need to. So like the given when then, it's still a good mindset to be in because that's all software is like it's in a state, we do a thing, it's in a different state. So like that's given when then still helps to be in that mindset. We don't need to always use that language in like the test descriptions though.
So here we could just do like translate Morse code to word or string.
Cool. So you can write the test like this. Be more specific. What is this like specific example doing?
Gotcha. So we would translate the Morse code of Kyle Rocks to Kyle Rocks, right?
Yes, exactly. And like it's for you and other developers and stuff. It doesn't need to be like translates these dots to this word.
So Kyle Rocks in Morse code, right?
Right. So translates Kyle Rocks from Morse code to English. That's a good test.
If we knew that this test like is gonna have like smaller components to it, would it be like the appropriate decision to make this like a describe, and then we know we're gonna have different subparts of this?
Not necessarily. Like I think that would be appropriate because it reads pretty well like this. It translates Kyle Rocks from Morse code to English. Now, like, remember this stuff is Kleenex, so we could just start here and add the describes. We can do the describes first if you want. Let's say like describe describe a fully functioning Morse code translator. And it's kind of like a little conversation you're having with yourself. Describe a fully functioning Morse code translator. Well, it would describe, it would translate Kyle Rocks Morse code to English for one. And it would probably translate SOS from Morse code to English. And there's one with the symbols. So like, maybe something like that. So like this is TDD. We haven't actually written any code really, but we've described how the app should work. We're trying to figure out what this app is. Questions so far? Cool. So now we need to figure out what winning looks like. How do we know in code that this worked? So we end up doing a few things in this step. We have to name the function. We have to figure out what variables get pushed in. We have to figure out what comes out of it. Those are design decisions. We're doing like some solution design a little bit. So we could say something like, all right, well, I'm gonna have Morse translator. That'll be the name of this function. And I expect Morse translator, say const Morse code equals whatever it actually ends up being. To be Kyle rocks. That's how I'll know that I'm done. And so we can do the same thing with these other ones. Another way to think of these is this is what you would be console logging when you think you're done. What would you see that would make you go, cool, it worked? That's what you're doing first.
I'll be right back. I'm gonna use it.
So then we can use, we need to figure out what victory looks like. And this is a tricky thing sometimes, is like, all right, what would the thing actually be? For something like this, we have stuff online that we can use, but sometimes part of this step is figuring out by hand what success looks like. So sometimes that means you're using a sample data set. It usually makes sense to like make a really reduced sample data set so it's easy to do the calculations by hand, because you need to know what success looks like. All right, so I want to have Kyle rocks. All right, there it is. Now it didn't do the spaces. So we go, all right, that's probably K, Y, L, E. Oh, that's that slash. So 1, 2, 3. All right, and there's our test. And if we run it, cool. I got failing tests. 3 failed, man. I wanted what? It's that. And SOS. And then there's like the special ones don't have any spaces in them, I don't think. Like that. Cool. So when this is done, that's what we see. So we actually did kind of a lot of things. This is where the code war shit starts. That's why it's like not really TDD, even though those tests end up helping you drive your development a little bit. All these conversations, figuring out what the different examples would be, all that stuff is part of TDD also. All right, I'm going to throw this in chat. So all of this kind of ends up forming our outer loop. Once I have this in place, that's really where we're looking at like, all right, what can I do that gets me one step closer to getting this done? And at that point, that's skip. I don't need to constantly be reminded that none of these pass. I know they don't pass. If I'm getting rid of them, just skipping them for right now. As we go into the next loop down. So next loop down might be something like, can it translate a single letter? Like dot is E. So I maybe do something like describe letter translation. Might be something that I would actually just use test for. Test translating letters. And so I would expect Morse translator dot to be E. Cool. Does the test fail? You know, it sure is getting annoying writing that npm test every time. I wonder if there's something else I could do. Well, turns out we could add another script to package JSON. Maybe call this one test watch. Like that. And now if I run test watch, it'll, every time the code changes, it'll just rerun the test automatically. So you can do something like npm test watch, npm run test watch. Cool. Now see how it's kind of hanging there? And hit enter anytime I want to rerun it manually. If I change that, it automatically runs. It's much nicer. All right, so I got a failing test. So part of this like TDD experience is kind of being a little coy sometimes. So I go, okay, I want to make a function called Morse translator, and I'm gonna just export that. And it takes in Morse code and returns, wait for it, E. All right, I got a passing test.
That's what I did.
Yep, and like that's the like traditional way this gets done. It does a few things. It tests that like your files load correctly. It tests that like this actual workflow works kind of the way that you think it does. It will also let you do stuff like, all right, am I actually getting the thing going in correctly? Why did it fail? It expected E and it got a dot. It's giving me such richer information than just console logging does, and it's being driven by the tests. So now that I have it working, can I keep it working while making it more real? So like I had pulled all that Morse code stuff off of their thing. They already had the table in there. So let me pull that in. Maybe do something like that.
Is it worth breaking this into another file right now, or is it better just keep it in
I could. Like, not my top concern right now, but yeah, I probably would ultimately. So, okay, Can I look up, does it still work if I do something like Morse look up Morse code? Yes, it does. Sweet. So now, just to make sure that it's not full of shit, or like sometimes people will do this, where they'll say, all right, I'm going to return E there. Can I make another test that's expecting, something else to be something else? So like R is dot dash dot. Oh, didn't pass because I'm hard coding E in there. This is called triangulation. Like you just try to come up with more examples of why your hard coded solution doesn't work. And then as you start, like you can add switch statements and cases and all those kinds of things. And at some point it just becomes more like faster to do a real implementation of it. And a lot of the times you don't actually need to do a real implementation of it for a while at least. All right, so then I can say, all right, I'm tired of being coy. If I look up that, and it passes. Okay, that got me one step closer to this eventual solution. What other things might I want to make sure that I can do?
Well, now we need
letter, space, letter.
Letter, space, letter. Yeah, totally. Can it do the spaces? That seems like small enough that we could probably figure that out. So okay. So give me an example, Damon.
We could do E space R, or sorry, expect Morse translator. And then we'd be passing in a string of dot, space, 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 dot, dash, dot, Td E space R. It did say 3 dots, right? Yeah. Oh, I said it did say 3 dots, right? For spaces?
Yeah, 3 spaces, yeah. Okay, so now we have a new problem. How do I do that? Does my test fail? Test is failing.
So this where we can we actually start, should we start actually like trying to write more code, or should we just make it?
I would.
Right. Yeah, because we don't want to like fail the last 2 tests just to pass this one, right?
Well, like the last 2 tests, they got us to here.
Yeah.
Frankly, if that passes, I don't need them anymore. So whatever, just delete them. They were scaffolding.
Cool. So now we would have to go to our translator.
Yep.
And in here, we would return back. We're actually gonna have to start looking at the string now.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, I'll tell you. Yeah, we might have to actually split the string that's being passed in.
How do split on what?
I would split on taking space, honestly.
Yep. Let's try it. Okay, so it's split. So now I presumably have an array of
letters, right?
Yeah.
Ooh,
So
but
what do I do with those?
then we would just put in the array of letters, or sorry, we will return back, or sorry, map through them.
Yeah. Okay. And what do I want to do with each one?
Each one we want to translate. So we would do the Morse code. Yeah.
this is exactly why we do this shit. What do we still have to do?
We have to join it at the end.
We have to join it now.
Yeah. So now we would, after the map, we would dot join. Yep, and we would do it on the. Oh yeah, just dot join. You just put in quotes, right?
I haven't. Let's see what that does.
Because we want a space in between. So
Yeah.
Yeah, do quotes. There you go.
Passing test.
Quick question: did anybody get an error with that big array? Does Zoom like mess with the character codes or something?
Oh yeah, you had to change the. It's not an array; it's an object.
Yeah.
The object. Oh yeah, yep, that's exactly what it is. Wasn't anything.
Cool. Hey, now we're starting to get somewhere. Cool. So like now that it's passing, clean that up a little bit maybe. Bring the split down there too. So as we're doing this, we can go like, all right, is it still passing? Still passing. Maybe that goes on one line. Still passing? Still passing. That looks ugly to me, so I'm going to make a function that just splits that out. Call it translate letter. And this is a big part. It's not, I'm not writing a test for this. It's an implementation detail. I might re-inline that. I don't have to redo my tests when I do that. So I do that. Is it still passing? Still passing. Cool. So then this can be translate letter.
Would you write test for translate letter if, let's say, translate letter wound up being useful somewhere else in your app? Would you maybe import it?
Yeah, I could buy that. Oop, but I'm not passing anymore. Received the function. Ah, that's why.
Yeah.
All right, now we're passing again. So that's the refactor step of it. Before you move on, how many times have you seen a student just fuck themselves because they just went too quickly? Do a little bit of cleanup work. That gives us a way cleaner place to do whatever the next steps are than the first code that we had passing this, which was this. That's fine, but it's little stuff like that that gets increasingly difficult to work with. So we took less than a minute and got it to that. A lot better.
I want to say that I want to keep the original test just to make sure that like now that we're, because I feel like we're kind of hard coding this. We put those, when we split it, we're splitting it at 3 spaces versus 1 space. So I feel like I wanted to keep the original test just to make sure one letter always works, that I'm not breaking that.
Yeah, maybe. But like, the thing is, it's not theoretical. Are you actually worried that like you're going to screw up that logic? Like, probably not. So like, it's not something we do just to do it. If you were actually worried, if this was like slightly more complex logic, maybe. But I'm not concerned about getting that wrong. So I'm not going to have tests for it.
Gotcha. And we're still decoding letters. So
yeah. And like, if this worked, a pretty good chance that the single letters are just fine. There's another argument against having a shit ton of like really tiny tests like that. You got to maintain them. This ends up being, oh, it takes an array of things and of Morse sentences or whatever. And now you have to like update all of those tests. Like, fuck that, man. That's the kind of thing that makes people hate testing.
Right.
Ooh, here's another cool thing. We could take this Morse thing now and put it inside the translate letter function. I'm not going to do it, but that was like an idea that I had. It's like, I can encapsulate all that together now. Okay, cool. So so we can like sanity check now. Do these work? I think one of them did. Yeah, the SOS did.
Yep.
So like we're making progress. Let me go back to skipping these. What's a test that would get us another step closer?
Having like multiple letters that are not space separated.
Yeah. So we might have translating words. So we can start with a simple example. How about just something like that? Should be that. Cool.
Is it two spaces that is supposed to represent a? There's two.
Three.
Three? Okay.
No,
No, wait.
right. Can I get
Three
that?
represents a space, but does two represent a new letter is what I mean.
No, 2 is nothing. It's 1 or 3.
1 or 3? Okay, thank you.
All right. So I was expecting back ER and I got nothing. Why did it get back nothing?
You split it by
Yeah.
3 spaces, so it didn't split at all, and that doesn't index out from Morse.
Yep. True story. So cool. So what do I need to do to make that test pass?
I think you need to like have a different logic for handling like how you're splitting it. Like I wouldn't just chain them necessarily, because you're gonna have to first split them by I guess single space. Well, that wouldn't. I guess you would split by triple space and then split each triple space split by their single spaces on the inside.
Yeah, I kind of like that. So if I take that,
you'd have to do a
then I have to map it.
Yeah.
So I would do a map where we take the word, and for each word, we do our single split.
Mhm.
Maybe something like that. And then for each of those,
Yep.
maybe we do something like that. And then let's see how far that gets us. Hey, not bloody bad. So I wonder if I just join those,
Mhm.
does that get the job done?
You have to join. Yeah.
Holy shit. Old test is still passing too. See how nice that feedback loop was? Like I wasn't even entirely sure what was happening there. It was just so cheap to try stuff. This is why like the labs are like kind of useless as assessments for the students. Because like you can sort of guess your way through this stuff sometimes. Spoiler alert, you can also do that with your own tests.
This is nice.
Cool.
If you had an in-between function that's like you're concerned about whether or not you did it right, would you write further tests on that?
Yeah.
Is that like, okay, so it's not like
I might delete them when I'm done, but yeah.
Okay, because I've definitely like encountered that before where one time tests saved my ass and I was like, holy shit, that's cool as fuck. But
Yeah.
okay.
So now I'm kind of wondering, does the whole suite work now? Maybe. Done. So, moment of truth. First of all, let's refactor a little bit. Can we clean that up at all? What if I try one-lining that and just nested that down? Maybe that's better. I like that better. I still kind of don't like it. I think my beef is that I want this whole map transformation to have a name.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's translate letter, maybe this whole thing is translate word.
Yeah.
Translate word. And so that would be Morse word. And when you have these tests, you can sort of do this stuff with abandon. Like if I didn't have the test, I'd have to be way more careful step by step about this than I'm actually being. Translate word.
Oh god, that looks so clean.
Yeah, and then that final result like reflects the logic that we came up with. Works pretty good. So real moment of truth is, does this work in the Code Wars thing? Let's see.
You have access to that Morse object in there?
So yeah, this one is Morse code. And then this was in here. Holy shit.
Oh yeah.
Give me my points. Ooh. Look at that. Anybody see what we didn't do? This is part of the instructions. I thought they were kind of stupid, but.
Backspaces, right? We got to check for like a space in the front and space in the back.
Exactly. So how do we handle that?
We could just cut them off, right? Like we could just.
What's the trick for that?
Can't you?
Dot trim.
Oh, there's a dot trim in JavaScript. Motherfucker. It basically is dot chomp.
Yep. There we go. Passing tests. We TDD'd the shit out of something. So that's the mindset. That's the process. Ask me some questions.
I don't really have any questions, but what I kind of see in this is that the same way you would go about approaching the problem without writing the test, you're almost doing the same process, except instead of getting that instant feedback with green and red, you're doing like console logs, right? To figure out.
Yes.
So it's almost
everybody
like
does test-driven development. They just don't keep the tests and they use the shittiest possible test.
I think that's the best part. It's like you don't really have to change your mind around how you would approach figuring out a problem.
Yeah.
You're just adding a little bit more, a little more context.
Yeah, and like a way more robust tool.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're done, the next person can run your same test that you did. When this starts getting really complicated, you get a sanity check. There's this thing that happens with huge apps that don't have tests where like, as soon as you can no longer keep the entire app in your head anymore, it becomes terrifying to change anything. You see something that looks useless and you go, well, I don't know what it does. I only know my part of the app. Somebody else might be using that. I better leave it alone. But I need it to do a slightly different thing. So I'm just going to make a copy of it and call it like Kyle's Morse code translator. And so you end up with like 30 of those strewn all over the app. Half the code base isn't even used anymore, but everybody's too scared to do anything about it. Because but if you have tests, I don't know what happens if you delete it. Deleted it, all the tests still pass. Fuck it. Who gives a shit?
As someone like entering the job market soon, hopefully, I'm curious, like, do most companies do this? And like, if so, which types of companies maybe don't do this? Or like, I don't know. Do you have any insight as far as that goes? I don't know that was a well-phrased question. That was a terribly phrased question.
No, I know what you're asking. And like, the sad truth is not many. This is, okay, so I saw a Quora question a couple months ago that was, how are any developers stupid enough to fall for TDD? Like, there are some hostile opinions about this. It's making everything take twice as long. Because you can write the test and I'm in a hurry. I don't know, man. If I were in a hurry, I'd want a whole lot of these things so I could just recklessly refactor shit. That's
Yeah.
speed.
I've already met people who are like, they seem fairly experienced and just don't like testing at all. And I think it's really cool. Like I'm almost wondering if I should choose companies based off of whether or not they do it. But
Here's a real life question or conversation that I had like last week.
in extreme programming,
Let's talk about when TDD is not appropriate. And that was my actual answer.
are there like certain types of programming where TDD is just really difficult to implement? Like that's something I've thought about. Like I don't know. I imagine if I compare like the amount of effort that we put into unit testing versus like the debouncer, right? I remember like at least it was like maybe an hour-long rabbit hole just to figure out how to test the debouncer. And then I can only imagine that there's other fields where that becomes even more severe significantly. What fields are like that where that's like maybe don't bother with testing driven development for this field, or is that never the case?
Here's the thing, like it took a long time to do the testing for that debouncer. It also took a long time to figure out if it worked because like all of the times where it was like, oh man, it's really hard to write this test and we've solved the problem. The tests eventually ended up showing that like, no, you didn't. You just made it delay and like how long it took to show, but it's still slow. And so like, there are times where like a TDD framework might not make so much sense. But like, I think some of you saw when I was doing that Python code challenge in front of the students the other day. I didn't want to learn a Python testing tool. So just put your console logs at the bottom of the file and like kind of write your test that way.
That makes sense.
Another thing that like I would say is probably, there's a thing you can do with Gherkin test that's kind of cool, where you can add tags to things. So you can say like, you can tag something as slow and then only run your slow test like once a day. You can also tag something as manual. So it's like, there's no good way to automatically test this, but it still needs to be tested before we do a deploy. So you can still write that script the exact same way that you would if it were automated, tag it as manual, and then have it print out all of your manual tests and hand those to a QA tester or something.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's smart.
My favorite part about the testing that we wrote is I didn't have to like break my brain on like, did we pass all the things that we needed to pass? Like the test takes care of that.
Yeah, and like every problem we were solving was kind of small. It takes away the like, it worked, and like, oh, why isn't this working? The high and low cycle, that's what TDD really gives you. You work in such small pieces. It's hard to get too excited about anything. It's also hard to get too stuck on anything. So we just smash down that excitement cycle.
Say I'm in like a job interview or something like that. Would it be, you think it'd be a good move to be like, oh, I see that you gave me this IDE. Is it cool if I bust out Jest on a personal project so I could do this with TDD? Like, do you think that'd be a good move or a bad move?
That's a pretty good flex. I like it. And at a minimum, when we do our Polya 4-step process for like whiteboard interviews and stuff, what do you think the IO table is? What do you think that like reflect step is at the end where we actually run through the code to see if it works? Like it's the same idea. Like really, this is just engineering.
Yeah.
Is there a way to do an input table kind of like you did in Gherkin, where we just pass it a whole bunch of things and make it the same name test?
Yeah, so since this is just code, watch this. So let's say we have an array of
that's all you needed to say.
Yep. So do something like that. And then for each, can even destructure this out of here, kind of like that.
Oh shit.
Still pass. Still passes.
Oh my god, I'm so slow at Vim.
Well, I've been doing this for a second.
Oh Lord.
Slow typer, so it's not even then would definitely be an issue for me.
There you go.
Nice. And then yeah, we just move all these in. And yeah, it's just,
And then we could make this, so it labeled the tests wrong. It said all of them were Kyle Rocks.
right.
So,
Translates Morse code to English, right?
just make it a template string.
Yep. Man, it feels like I'm in the boot camp trying to keep up with you again.
So let's see.
And then I only need one it.
There you go. That's called a parameterized test.
Gotcha.
Now, here's the thing to keep in mind, though, like before you get too happy with this kind of stuff, is your tests are also your documentation. This is a little bit more difficult to read than what we had before.
Yeah. For like the average person, right? The one that's
Right, exactly. It's probably a little easier to figure out what's happening if you see this. Like what constitutes good test code is usually the opposite of what constitutes good real code. You want to be repetitive. You want to be verbose. Because imagine this suite is like 3 pages long. And you see some little thing in here that depends on something that's at the top of the file that references something in another file. Like that's obnoxious as fuck. You don't want to have to like dig through documentation like that. So you repeat yourself all the time in these kinds of tests. But I don't know, you can make an argument that especially if this had a lot of examples, it's easier to read. But like there's the trade-offs that you're looking at.
And in this case, like you can just remove one of these objects from the array, so it's not
right
super tied together.
I think I want to try and make a script that like default sets up a HackerRank project because you can download their inputs and outputs. And then I want to get like the function import things. I'm sorry, the like where you can, the file reads like figured out where I can like just make an array of here's the inputs, here's the corresponding outputs. That'd be a cool script to make, I think.
If you want, like, it's good practice, but you really want to practice doing this stuff with the HackerRank stuff. Think about how much we did before we got to the point where the HackerRank stuff starts. So like flex those muscles too. Figure out your own test cases given the instructions that you had. That's the like analysis part of TDD.
That makes sense. I definitely like, I've, out of all the code challenge things I've used, I fucking hate the HackerRank IDE. I fucking hate it. It's miserably bad. It gives you no feedback when you fuck something up. It doesn't even tell you the JavaScript error message, like, or the compiler error message. Which is...
Oh, one last thing I'll leave you with, and then we should take a break before we go to this next thing. I would probably delete this at this point. Like it does what I expect it to do. I actually don't care about those smaller functions like long-term. If this works, I'm happy with it.
Right.
Those other tests were still useful while I was writing them, but I don't know if I want to maintain these.
Right.
So fuck them.
I guess my question with that is if something breaks, right?
Yeah.
How do you know you delete all that stuff? Does your ability to identify like where this thing broke get any worse? So for example,
a little bit, but you can also just rewrite the tests. Like none of those were hard to write. And here's another thing you can do if you're super worried about it. We really should have been doing git commits every time we went from red to green. So you just pull it out of an old version.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, I like that.
Would you ever break your functions out into named functions?
In the tests,
Mm-hmm.
never.
Because I've never seen it happen before.
Yep. And that's part of that, like, be more verbose, be more repetitive. Like, all of those values for test code definitely hold true. The fact that we're passing a function in, it's not a function. It's like it's a thing that we have to do to make the test read like sentences and still execute code.
Gotcha.
That's why we don't want it to be a separate function.
Gotcha.
Wait. What do you mean by break it the function apart? I don't understand what
Like, if we had it translates code to English as this function here, and then did this, and then did
Gotcha. Okay.
that.
Nope, that makes more sense. I didn't know what was meant by that question. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind of thing where you go like, okay, so that's the test. Wait a minute. So now I got to look for that function here. What was this thing called again? Like, you run into that problem.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right, let's take a break. Let's start at like let's start at 110. We'll be all right.
I think we got Brian's meeting us at 1 for the culture stuff.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Like, let's push him back 10 minutes.
Cool.
God,
so
we
we can,
need food.
so we can eat and pee and like not look at each other for a sec.
All right, see y'all then.
See you guys in a sec.